You finished taking your notes. Now what? Well, here's a hint. Don't stick them at the bottom of your bag or just leave them on your laptop until about a week before your exams. This presentation is going to tell you a number of different strategies that you can use to actively review your notes on a periodic basis so that it just becomes a natural part of your studying. One key to actively reviewing your notes is to do so in a timely manner. And so you might set a gauge of either within 24 hours after taking the notes or within one class session. One way to help yourself remember is to just have it be a habit to go through your notes either before or after each subsequent class session. As you do this, you want to make sure that you identify points that your instructor emphasized. And you may have already done this when you were taking your notes. So either focus on those again or take note of anything that you recognize your professor had stated in a different tone of voice, had added a lot of additional detail to, or had even mentioned something such as, this is really important, this will be on the exam, this is a favorite idea of mine, and so forth. Another way to look for important points is through highlighting. And just like when you are going through readings, you don't want to highlight everything. Less is truly more. Focus on what is most essential, such as main ideas or definitions. You can also take notes on your notes through adding annotations. And in so doing, it's almost as if you're creating a dialogue between what is on the page, what was said through a literal sense, and then your own reflections on the importance or connections to other ideas or examples. And if you're doing this in a different color, it's still clear, though, what was the original lecture and what are your ways of thinking about it. Another thing to consider in terms of a dialogue is how what's on your page of notes is interacting with how it might be covered in your assigned readings, whether it's an article, a course packet, or a textbook. And by finding overlap, one, you're going to see probably what really is the key point, but in addition to that, you're going to find are there additional details or other shades of meaning that fill in the gaps of your comprehension so you have a really full, in-depth understanding of what the major points are. Another method that you can use when reviewing is a questioning method. With this sort of approach, you're considering everything that's on the page of notes as potential answers to questions that you might see, for instance, on an exam. And so really your goal in this method is to think about what questions does the information in my notes answer. And then as you're creating these questions, there's a number of ways that you can incorporate them into your studying. For one, you might simply write the questions in the margin, and as you go back to review, your goal is to see, can I answer this without looking at the notes? And when you do come up with the answer, see if you can compare that to what you have down to make sure that you are grasping it accurately. A second method is to put the questions and answers on flashcards and test yourself that way. As you go through them, start to separate out the ones that you get really well and the ones that you need to go back through. And the third method is to use all of these questions and to use them to create and take your own sample exams. There's many ways that you could come up with questions, but they all boil down into about three major categories. The first of these is reflection questions. These have the intent of reflecting back a main point. And so typically this might be a definition, a description, or a cause and or effect. A second major category of question is the recap question. The purpose of this is to summarize, and so usually this is either the larger topic that was spoken of during that entire lecture or a major portion of the lecture, because here, rather than just a single point, you want to be drawing connections among those ideas or even comparing and contrasting, for instance, different theories, different approaches, different characters, different historical events, and so forth. The third major type of question is the reasoning question. Here you're really using your brain and thinking outside of the box. And so, for instance, you might ask, what if, why, or how would be a third major type of stem for the reasoning question that you might be creating. Clearly, this takes a little bit of extra work, and so it's perfectly fine to ask why bother to ask questions. And there's a number of reasons why you might choose to do so. For one, it helps you to stay focused. Rather than simply having your goal of reading through everything, your goal with these questions is to identify the major points and to answer them accurately. By doing so, you're really deepening your understanding. And as you're adding your own information to this, your own personality, your own way of thinking, you're making that content more memorable by what you add to it. As you go through these types of questions and you're applying the information, one of the interesting things that you might find is that you're not going to be in a situation where you get to an exam and you say, hey, we never covered this. Why is it on the exam? Which can be really frustrating for students. The more that you get used to thinking outside the box, applying the content to different situations, the easier it is to respond to that type of question. Even if the content itself of the question isn't identical, the structure likely will be. And then finally, you just get in the habit of anticipating exam questions, and that's a great space to be in. In terms of how this all comes together, here's an example. First, imagine that these were the efficient notes that you had taken in the class and now you wanted to go back through them. One thing that you might do is create a question related to a definition. A second thing you might do is try to recap some of these pieces of information and how they tie together. You'll also notice that there's highlighting for these major points. If, for instance, you had missed something during the lecture, by underlining it, going back to another resource, asking a professor, going to your textbook, you can always fill in that information. And if you find that something is covered both in the lecture and the book, it's helpful to yourself if you can just make an annotation in terms of where you can find that additional information. You could also create a reasoning question to think about, how does this connect to something that I already understand, to really strengthen your grasp of the connections between this information and that information. At the bottom, you might also add a larger summary, the big idea that is coming up through this portion of notes. And for those of you familiar with the Cornell note-taking method, this is very similar. And so if you're not familiar, that might be something additional that you could look up. If you're interested in learning more about active note-taking or active note reviewing strategies, feel free to visit the Learning Center's website, or if you're on campus, we'd love to have you stop by.